Walk the sleigh's rubbish.
Konnichiwa, stekena minasan. Today we're taking a look at Fabula Ultima, a TTJRPG, where the J stands for Japanese. Since Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1, really, the goal of creating a tabletop role-playing game that can imitate Japanese RPG computer games has been a goal for a huge number of people. You may remember the Returners and their slab of a game that was meant to emulate Final Fantasy. It is a very hard thing to do. The complexity of computer games, juxtaposed with the simplicity of their interface, cannot be that easily translated as a tabletop experience. And that experience of simplicity, as well as the style and the story beats and the fixations of JRPGs, that's what you really want to replicate, I think. I think that's what people intend to replicate. I've been reviewing and seeking out translations of Japanese tabletop RPGs, of which there's been a spate relatively recently. But actual Japanese RPGs are not perhaps what you would expect. Most of them are centered around the use of six-sided dice, because polyhedrals weren't easy to get in Japan for a very long time. And their systems tend to be quite formal, procedural, and even quite complex, despite the relative simplicity of a six-sided dice. Sword World, etc. There are fan translations of Sword World, or as a substitute you can buy the Goblin Slayer RPG. They're fairly complicated and procedural once you dig into them. Also, generally speaking, the actual content of Japanese RPGs tends to be a little bit more whimsical, but that may be a sample bias of this is the games that people have chosen to translate. Why do we have our own Dark Souls RPG rather than just the translation of the Japanese RPG? I've got no real idea, but maybe the Japanese TTRPG scene and its design choices, when it comes to system at least, wouldn't fly over here in the West, where the culture of gaming has consistently become more narrativist, more simple, and less procedural, so very different to the way in which Japanese games seem to have developed and proceeded. Now, Fabula Ultima seems to be far more focused on the typical story themes and structure of the storytelling in Japanese computer game RPGs, where characters are ultimately important, where they all have something special or individual to them, where they all have their own sub-plot lines, things like that. And this game is not a definitive set game with a particular background, rather it is a toolkit for creating JRPG-style worlds that maybe have similar characteristics running through them, in the same way that Final Fantasy games tend to have similar characteristics running through them. So this isn't a game world in and of itself, but rather it has these common elements that go across all of these different potential settings, and it is as much a toolkit for coming up with your own settings as it is anything else. So there's not a lot of world background and so on I can go into here, but mostly about the system. So characters are defined in a number of different ways. They have traits, identity, theme, and origin, which you can invoke for bonuses and so on. It's not unlike Fate and its aspects. You have bonds, which are emotional ties to up to 6 different people or things that you super duper care about. You have Fabula points, which provides story control and power manifestation to a degree. Characters, perhaps unusually, start at level 5 and run through up to level 50, and you can mix and match classes as you develop your character, which makes them a bit more like jobs, I suppose, and the different jobs grant different skills and abilities. So you can see why you start at level 5. That allows you to mix and match the classes as you want to develop the character that you want. So free and easy, nice and breezy. That's how that works. You do still have conventional attributes, dexterity, insight, might, and willpower. And then from all this, you derive your hit points, your mind points, and your inventory points, which is an abstract way of tracking stuff. So you can buy a certain amount of inventory points, and then as you play, you cross off inventory points to pull out a particular potion that you might need or a quest item that you might need. So it's a way of abstracting that, which I don't know whether it's genius or stupid quite yet. Different things cost different amounts of inventory points, kind of depending how useful they are, I suppose, really. But it is a nice way of not getting too bogged down in what equipment you might be carrying, and instead having a sort of potential amount of equipment that you might be carrying. I actually might go in and customize that a bit more so that if it's an item that your class is particularly associated with, it might reduce the cost slightly. So if you have a healer on team, they would have to pay slightly less to produce healing potions, for example. Something like that. It's not a bad idea. You also have defense scores, magic defense scores, initiative, and you do have some set equipment, so you have some starting stuff. Rolls are made with 2 dice, determined by your stats, and then modified. So you combine 2 stats to produce the dice that you're going to roll. You roll those dice, and then you add them. So if you're doing a feat of pure strength, you might roll your might die and your might die again, adding them together. And say you had 2 levels in appropriate skill, you would add 2 to the total. That's all rolled against the difficulty level, which you have to equal or exceed in order to score a success. Sometimes the highest roll of the 2 dice involved is used to determine how much damage you do in combat, or some magical effect or special effect. So it kind of combines all those rolls into one in a lot of ways. You score a critical success if the 2 numbers on the dice are the same and both 6 or higher. If they both roll a 1, that's a fumble. Critical hits provide opportunities, which can be any sort of positive effect agreed by the games master, but typically include some sort of advantage on the next roll that you make, create an affliction, which is like a status setting, creating or changing a particular bond to a character or enemy, causing someone to stumble and make a faux pas in a social situation, earn a favor from a sponsor, extract some additional information, destroy an item, maybe you shiver someone's shield to pieces, make extra progress on an extended test, or a group test, that sort of thing, create a plot twist, figure out what an enemy's weakness might be, what their motivations might be, and so on. So yeah, lots of opportunity for the kind of things the Cypher system calls GM intrusions, or player intrusions in this case. Difficulty levels run from about 7 to about 16. That's your scale from easy to very hard. So obviously if you had 2d4 in a stat, getting a 7 would be reasonably challenging. And you'd need at least 2d8 to stand a chance of getting a 16. Complicating matters, say if you have an applicable trait, you can spend Fabula points to re-roll your dice unless you fumbled. Bonds can be invoked to add their strength to the total of the roll in a similar way. So if you're emotionally invested as a character in the scene, or someone you've got a bond with is threatened or whatever, then you get to add a bonus like that. There are all kinds of dramatic moments or opportunities throughout the rules where you can decide on the fate of your enemies when you beat them. If your character dies, you can choose to sacrifice yourself to make a big difference in what's going on, and that's kind of the emphasis here. So it certainly captures the sort of high drama and emotion that a lot of JRPGs try to invoke, and the importance of characters and their central place as being the main driver of the world. This isn't something where you play a sort of zero to hero, rather you start off as a relatively low capability hero and then rise up to become a world shaking hero, and stories and so on should very much be centered around the characters, kind of the opposite of a sandbox campaign in a lot of ways. So this is a game where character and background and the character's emotions and investment and past and so on are all very important and may well come back to haunt you. As a toolkit, it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail on anything. There's a reasonable selection of spells, equipment, monsters. That's a large part of what kind of bulks up the page count here, along with a whole bunch of subsystems for handling things like travel, all of that sort of thing. It probably could have done with some more monsters. It doesn't look like there's a huge amount of supplementary and supporting material out for Fabula Ultima. You can purchase it on drive-thru, if I remember. I'll put a link down below. So what do I think overall of Fabula Ultima then? The book is a nice object, though I tend to find that the use of dust covers on RPG books is probably not a good idea because they see a lot of use and these tend to be vulnerable. Mine's already curling at the edges and I haven't had it long at all, and it's a shame that the book underneath didn't have a colour cover. Hardback probably would have been a better bet. The paper stock's nice, though a bit shiny and a bit vulnerable to smearing, which is unfortunate. The colour interior is a mix of nice, bright graphic illustrations and things that are a bit more muted and watercolory. But not bad by any means. Style-wise, I think the presentation is more Final Fantasy IX than anything else, though perhaps a little bit less cutesy. I do like the art. It's relatively sparing, but where it's used, it's effective. And if you look to actual Japanese RPGs, they often have very little art whatsoever. But this is, at the end of the day, a Western conception of what a Japanese RPG is or should be or could be, which is it's an interesting little puzzle to wrap your head around there as well, especially if, like me, you've been researching actual Japanese RPGs, which take a very different path. That said, I think it does accomplish what it sets out to do. It's a neat little system. It's a relatively simple little system. Just it's got quite a lot of subsystems and so on, but you don't need to worry about them until you need to worry about them. Style-wise then, the writing is nice and light. It's relatively clear compared to a lot of games. I believe the makers of this are Spanish or Portuguese, perhaps, or maybe Italian. Not sure. Anyway, they're not English, but it's not a problem. The book is readable. It's well translated. Like I say, it's a reasonably light, breezy, conversational style. The artwork's nice and evocative of the very things that it's trying to evoke. So style then, yeah, and the system supports all that. So style is at a low 5. I would have liked a bit more art and a little bit more depth on some things, perhaps, but then maybe there's more stuff coming along. I believe they have a high fantasy guidebook, which maybe adds interesting additional elements to it. Remains to be seen. Maybe I'll get a copy of that. If you are buying it, I do recommend getting the official, actual hard copy, because it is a nice object, even with the dust jacket. In terms of substance, I mean, it's a toolkit, so it covers a lot of things quite shallowly. Unfortunately, as I say, I would have liked a bit more depth in what it covers, but it is a toolkit game, so you wouldn't necessarily expect it to. So in terms of substance, then I think a low 4. So style low 5, substance low 4. It's 9 out of 10. 4.5 out of 5. Because I said low, probably a bit closer to a 4 than a 4.5 out of 5. But still, a damn good score. If you are a connoisseur of translated Japanese RPGs but want to see a Western take to compare and contrast, I think Fabula Ultima is a good one. And of the attempts to recreate the JRPG experience in tabletop, I think this is the best one I've seen. Zang. A problem for every games master has always been coming up with adventure ideas. For years now, Postmortem Studios has been helping out with the 100 Adventure Seeds line. These provide adventure ideas for all genres, and you can get them at RPG Now or lulu.com.
Grim gave a big yawn and settled down to sleep. And of course, when Grim goes to sleep, all of his friends go to sleep too. The people on the internet were just text on a screen. The collectibles were just cheap plastic tat, and the books were just elaborate sandwiches made of wood and paper. Even Grim himself, once he was asleep, was just an old saggy goth twat, baggy and a bit loose at the seams, and nobody loved him.